Ethan Brooks had always lived a quiet life. People in the town of Redstone Creek often described him as the man who preferred the company of horses over humans. Every morning before sunrise, Ethan woke to the soft sounds of the wind brushing against the wooden walls of his small ranch house. He would step outside with a cup of warm coffee, look out at the endless fields stretching into the distance, and breathe in the cool, peaceful air. His ranch sat about 5 miles from town, far enough to keep him away from the noise and gossip, but close enough for people to know who he was. Ethan never made a big entrance anywhere. He came to town once or twice a week for supplies, keeping his hat low and speaking only when needed. Some people thought he liked being alone, while others believed he was hiding some big story from his past. The truth was much simpler. Ethan just liked peace. He had no family left, and the ranch was all he had. His parents had passed away years earlier and left him the land. Ethan took care of it with quiet pride. On the other side of Redstone Creek lived Judge Harold Whitmore, a man everyone in town respected. The judge had lived there for more than 20 years and was known for being fair but firm. When he walked down the street, people greeted him politely. He was not a man who smiled easily, but when he did, it held a kind of warmth that made others feel safe. He believed in discipline, order, and good values. Judge Whitmore lived in a large white house on a hill overlooking Redstone Creek. It was the kind of house that made visitors stand a little straighter and speak more politely. But inside that grand home lived someone gentler, Lydia Whitmore, the judge's wife. Lydia was the heart of the town. She greeted everyone with a warm smile, remembered names, and often baked cookies for children who passed by her garden. Lydia had always been kind to Ethan whenever she saw him in town. She never looked at him the way others sometimes did, with curiosity or suspicion. Instead, she greeted him as if he were any other neighbor. Ethan appreciated that, even if he rarely showed it. He would nod, tip his hat, and quietly continue on his way. They were not friends, but there was a small, unspoken respect between them. Although Lydia looked graceful and cheerful, she had been dealing with health problems for years. Doctors had told her to rest more, but she often ignored their advice. She believed the town needed her, especially since the judge was busy most days with court matters. She didn't want to trouble anyone with her condition, not even her husband. Redstone Creek was the kind of town where news traveled faster than the wind. But not every truth made its way into public conversations. People talked about small things: whose fence broke in the storm, who purchased a new wagon, whose child got in trouble at school. But Lydia's health was something she kept quiet. Only a few close friends knew she sometimes grew weak or needed help. The judge, although caring, was a man who believed Lydia was strong enough to handle her own affairs. He respected her independence and rarely questioned her when she said she was fine. Ethan lived his days like clockwork. He would wake early, feed the horses, repair fences, check the cattle, and ride around the property. There was something calming about the routine. He didn't need much excitement, and he didn't go looking for it. He found comfort in predictable days and quiet nights. One late summer morning, Ethan saddled his horse and headed into town for supplies. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and gold. As he rode along the dirt path, he noticed how still everything felt. Only the birds chirped in the distance. His horse trotted steadily, kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. When Ethan reached the general store, a few townspeople nodded at him. He nodded back. He walked down the aisles quietly, picking up feed, rope, and a few small items he needed for repairing the barn roof. As he moved to the counter, he heard 2 women whispering near the entrance. They were talking about the upcoming town fair. Nothing new, nothing important. Ethan paid, loaded his supplies onto his horse, and headed back home. He didn't stop for small talk or join any conversation. People were used to his silence by now. As he rode past the hill where the judge's house stood, he slowed his horse slightly. Not because he was curious, but because Lydia had planted rows of bright sunflowers along the fence that always caught his attention. They swayed softly in the wind, reminding him of his mother's old garden. He paused for a moment, looking at them. That was the closest thing to happiness. He allowed himself small, quiet moments. Life in Redstone Creek moved gently, with no rush. Children played in the fields. Farmers worked under the sun. And elders sat on their porches telling stories. Everyone seemed to know their place, their routines, and their roles. Nothing dramatic ever happened there. Or at least, that's what people believed. But sometimes, life changes without warning. Like a sudden storm arriving on a clear day. Around this time, Lydia's health slowly began to worsen. She felt tired more often. And simple tasks like walking across the room sometimes left her breathless. She tried her best to hide it. Smiling whenever someone stopped by. Pushing through her chores, and reassuring the judge that everything was fine. But deep inside, she felt fear growing. She didn't want to become a burden to her husband. She didn't want him to feel torn between his duties in town and her needs at home. One evening, after the judge left for an important meeting in a nearby city, Lydia felt a strange heaviness in her chest. It wasn't painful, but it was worrying. She sat down, took a deep breath, and told herself it would pass. It usually did, but this time, the feeling stayed longer. She tried to stand, but her legs felt weak. She sat back down, whispering a small prayer. The town slept peacefully under the stars that night, unaware of what was coming. Ethan, meanwhile, finished his chores and sat by the fireplace with a simple dinner. He looked out the window, noticing the faint glow of lanterns on the judge's hill. He didn't think much of it. He didn't know that Lydia was slowly growing weaker by the minute. Morning came again, like it always did. Ethan stepped outside and saw clouds gathering in the distance. The weather looked unpredictable. But he had animals to check and fences to mend. He saddled his horse and began his usual rounds. What he didn't know was that this particular morning would change everything for him, for Lydia, for the judge, and for the entire town. Because fate has a strange way of bringing people together exactly when they least expect it. And soon, Ethan Brooks, the quiet rancher who avoided attention, would find himself at the center of a story that no one in Redstone Creek would ever forget. The sun was barely rising when Ethan Brooks stepped out of his small ranch house. The sky carried a dull gray color, and the clouds looked heavy, hinting at a possible storm later in the day. Ethan didn't mind storms, but he knew he needed to finish his morning rounds before the weather turned. He saddled his horse and began riding toward the far side of his property, where the fences often loosened after strong winds. His life was steady, predictable, and silent. He liked it that way. He talked mostly to his horse, his cattle, and sometimes the wind. People of Redstone Creek had accepted long ago that Ethan wasn't the kind of man who stayed long in conversations. Many didn't understand him, but no one doubted that he was a good man. As he checked the fence line, his horse suddenly stopped, lifting its ears. Ethan frowned slightly and looked in the direction his horse was pointing. There was nothing but open land and distant trees. But the air felt different, heavy, quiet. Even the birds weren't singing. Ethan shook it off and continued riding, but a strange feeling rested in his chest, like something wasn't quite right. Meanwhile, in the large white house on the hill, Lydia Whitmore lay weakly on her couch. She had barely slept the whole night. Every time she turned, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She tried to drink water in the early morning, but even lifting the glass felt like lifting a bucket of stones. She wished her husband was home, but he had traveled to a nearby city to attend an important meeting. Lydia didn't want him to worry. She never wanted to be the reason he missed work. So she remained quiet, hoping her strength would return soon. But the weakness grew stronger. The room felt warmer than usual. Her breathing became shallow. She tried to stand up, but her legs trembled. When she tried to call for help, her voice barely came out. Back on the dirt path, Ethan finished checking the fences and decided to pass by the judge's hill on his way home. He didn't plan to stop. He never did. But something made him look toward the house a little longer this time. The gate at the front was open, swinging slightly in the wind. Lydia was always careful with her home. She never left things out of place. That caught Ethan's attention. He slowed his horse. The windows were closed, and the yard was still, almost too still for a place normally filled with life. The smoke from the chimney was thin and weak, not like the strong, warm smoke Lydia used to make when she cooked breakfast. Ethan looked around, expecting to see someone in the yard, but it was empty. He didn't want to intrude. It wasn't his place. But something inside him whispered that something was wrong. He dismounted his horse and walked toward the open gate. It creaked softly in the breeze. He knocked on the front door, waiting for Lydia to appear with her gentle smile, ready to tell him she was fine and the gate had simply slipped open. But no one came. Ethan knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. His heartbeat rose slightly. He called out her name, just loud enough to be heard inside. Silence answered him. For a man who avoided stepping into other people's lives, Ethan now felt a strong need to act. He gently pushed the door, and it opened with a soft creak. He stepped inside cautiously, calling Lydia's name again. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The air felt stale, as if it hadn't moved all night. Ethan walked through the hallway, past the framed pictures on the wall, and moved toward the living room. That's when he saw her, Lydia, lying on the couch, eyes half open, breathing weakly. For a moment, Ethan froze. He wasn't used to seeing people in such a fragile state, but he quickly regained focus and rushed to her side. Lydia tried to speak, but her voice came out as a faint whisper he could barely hear. "Help," she managed to say. Ethan knelt beside her, keeping his voice calm. "I'm here," he said. "You're going to be all right." He carefully helped her sit up, supporting her back with his arm. Lydia shook her head slightly, trying to stay awake, but her eyelids kept dropping. Ethan knew she needed medical help quickly. He looked around the house, thinking of calling someone, but the nearest neighbor was too far, and Ethan didn't want to waste time searching for help. The small clinic in town was the only option. He had to get her there. He gently lifted Lydia into his arms. She was light, far lighter than he expected. Her head rested against his shoulder as he carried her out of the house. The wind had grown stronger now, and the clouds above darkened even more. He placed her carefully onto his horse and climbed up behind her, supporting her so she wouldn't fall. He clicked his tongue, and the horse started galloping toward town. The ride felt longer than usual. Every second mattered. Lydia's breathing was shallow, and Ethan kept whispering to her, trying to keep her awake. "You're doing fine," he said softly. "Just hold on a little longer." They reached Redstone Creek faster than Ethan thought possible. People in town turned their heads in surprise when they saw Ethan Brooks, normally quiet and distant, riding fast through the street with the judge's wife in his arms. Gasps filled the air. Store owners stepped outside. Children stopped playing. Everyone watched as Ethan rode toward the clinic. The doctor, an older man named Dr. Timpson, heard the commotion and rushed out. His eyes widened when he saw Lydia's condition. "What happened?" the doctor asked. "Found her weak," Ethan replied briefly. "She needs help." The doctor nodded and quickly guided Ethan inside. They placed Lydia on a bed, and Dr. Timpson began checking her pulse, her breathing, everything he could. A nurse rushed in to help. Ethan stood nearby, his hat still in his hand, watching quietly. After a few minutes, the doctor turned to him. "You got her here just in time," he said. "Another hour, and she might have collapsed completely." Ethan let out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He felt a strange mix of relief and worry. Lydia was safe for now, but he knew the judge was away and had no idea what had happened. Lydia slowly opened her eyes. When she saw Ethan standing nearby, she gave him a weak smile. "You saved me," she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "Just did what anyone would." But Lydia knew the truth. Not everyone would have noticed an open gate. Not everyone would have stepped inside. And not everyone would have carried her all the way to town. The doctor recommended she stay at the clinic for a few hours to gain strength. Ethan wanted to stay nearby until she was fully stable. He sat quietly outside her room, staring at the wooden floor, trying to understand how such an ordinary morning turned into something so unexpected. People in town whispered as they passed by the clinic windows. They had never seen Ethan so involved with anyone. Some were surprised, some were curious, some, unfortunately, already started forming their own stories. But Ethan didn't care about any of that. He only cared that Lydia was safe. When Lydia regained enough strength to speak properly, she asked for Ethan. He stepped inside her room, keeping his distance so she wouldn't feel uncomfortable. "I don't want the judge to worry," Lydia said softly. "Not until he returns. Please, don't tell him yet." Ethan was surprised by her request. He didn't understand why she wanted to keep this quiet, but he respected her. Lydia had always been kind. And if this was what she wished, he would honor it. "I won't say a word," Ethan promised. Lydia relaxed slightly and closed her eyes again. Ethan stepped outside, stood under the cloudy sky, and took a deep breath. The wind had picked up, and the first drops of rain began to fall. He looked back at the clinic, then toward the judge's hill in the distance. What happened today had changed something inside him. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he felt it clearly. Life in Redstone Creek had always been calm and predictable. But this moment marked the beginning of a story the town would talk about for years to come. And Ethan Brooks, the quiet rancher no one really noticed, had just taken the first step into the center of it. The days after Lydia's collapse passed slowly, and the town of Redstone Creek kept whispering about the quiet rancher who had carried the judge's wife in his arms. Some people spoke kindly, admiring Ethan for acting quickly. Others let their imagination wander, creating stories that had no truth in them. In a town where small news turned into big tales, Ethan's name was suddenly on everyone's lips, but Ethan didn't care about any of it. His only concern was Lydia. After the doctor allowed her to go home, she was still very weak. She could walk short distances, but simple tasks exhausted her. The judge had not returned yet from his trip, and Lydia insisted that Ethan keep everything private until her husband came back. Ethan respected that. He had given his word, and for him, a promise was as strong as iron. Every morning, after feeding his animals, Ethan rode toward the judge's house on the hill. At first, he felt uncertain. He had never visited anyone regularly before, but Lydia needed help, and she had no one else nearby. Ethan knocked softly every time, and Lydia greeted him with a tired but grateful smile. He brought her groceries, chopped wood for the fireplace, fetched water from the well, and made sure she ate properly. He fixed loose hinges, fed her chickens, and even repaired the garden fence that had been damaged in the wind. Lydia watched him work with quiet appreciation. She tried to help, but Ethan always reminded her to rest. "You need strength," he would say gently. "Let me handle this." Lydia would smile softly and sit in her rocking chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket. She often talked to him in a warm, friendly tone. Ethan wasn't used to talking much, but with Lydia, he found himself speaking more than usual. She asked about his ranch, his horses, his daily life. He answered simply, but he could see that she enjoyed listening. One afternoon, after cleaning the porch, Ethan sat on the steps to rest for a moment. Lydia handed him a glass of cold water. "You're a good man, Ethan," she said quietly. He didn't know how to respond. Compliments made him uncomfortable. He simply nodded and looked down at the glass. "You didn't have to do all this," she continued. Ethan looked at her with calm eyes. "I couldn't walk away," he said. "You needed help." Lydia smiled again, warmed by his honesty. But while Lydia saw kindness and loyalty, the townspeople saw something else. They saw Ethan visiting the judge's house every day, sometimes twice a day. They saw him carrying bags, tools, and firewood. They saw Lydia standing at the door, waving goodbye to him, and little by little, whispers started floating around. At the general store, two men leaned close and muttered, "Why is Ethan there so often?" Near the bakery, a group of women shared curious glances. "Did you see him yesterday evening?" He was there again. "Ah." Even the children noticed. "Mama, why is the rancher always at the judge's house?" The whispers grew louder with each passing day. Some people tried to defend Ethan, saying he was helping Lydia while the judge was away, but others believed whatever story sounded more exciting. Ethan heard some of the talk when he went to town for supplies, but he ignored it. He wasn't there for gossip. He wasn't there for attention. He was there because Lydia needed help, and it was the right thing to do. One evening, dark clouds gathered again over Redstone Creek. Lydia sat near the window, looking worried. She held a letter in her hand. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked gently. "It's from Harold," she said, referring to her husband. "He's coming home tomorrow." Ethan nodded slowly. It was good news, of course. Lydia needed her husband. But he also knew that the judge would hear all the gossip before he even reached home. That worried Ethan more than anything else. Lydia looked troubled as well. "People will twist the story," she whispered. "They already have." Ethan remained quiet. He didn't want her to worry. He didn't want the judge to misunderstand, either. But he had already decided something deep inside. When the judge returned, Ethan would tell him everything exactly as it happened. Straight and honest. No confusion, no fear. The next day arrived with bright, warm sunlight. Lydia waited nervously in the living room, wearing a clean dress and brushing her hair carefully. Ethan stood outside by his horse, preparing to leave before the judge arrived. He didn't want to make Lydia uncomfortable, but before he could mount his horse, he heard the sound of wheels on gravel. A carriage approached the house, and Harold Whitmore, the judge, stepped out with his suitcase. Ethan stayed still. The judge noticed him right away. His brows tightened slightly, showing confusion. Lydia rushed outside and hugged her husband. "You're home," she said softly. Harold held her carefully. "I came as soon as I could. Then his eyes turned to Ethan. Ethan removed his hat respectfully. "Judge," he said quietly. The judge looked from Ethan to Lydia, then back to Ethan. His eyes were sharp, and Ethan could tell that he had already heard rumors. There was a question in those eyes, a question shaped by town gossip, not truth. Lydia squeezed her husband's arm. "Harold, let's go inside. I need to explain." But Ethan stepped forward gently. "No, ma'am," he said to Lydia. "Let me speak first." The judge crossed his arms, waiting. Ethan took a deep breath. He didn't speak loudly, but every word carried weight. "I found your wife weak that morning," he said. "The gate was open. Something felt wrong. I went inside. She couldn't stand, so I carried her to the clinic. After that, she asked me to keep things quiet until you came home." The judge listened, expression unreadable. "I helped her with chores only because she needed help," Ethan continued. "Nothing more. The doctor said she shouldn't be alone. So I came by, did what needed doing, and left. That's all there is to it." There was a long silence. Lydia looked at her husband with hopeful eyes. She knew Ethan was telling the truth. She always trusted him. Now she hoped her husband would trust him too. Harold Whitmore studied Ethan's face. Ethan didn't fidget. He didn't look away. His eyes were calm and honest. The judge had seen many faces in court, liars, troublemakers, innocent folks, but something about Ethan's steady gaze struck him. This was a man who didn't speak more than needed. This was a man who would never cross a line. Finally, the judge let out a long breath. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly, surprising Ethan. "You saved her life. You helped her when she needed it most." Ethan looked away, embarrassed by the praise. Anyone would have done the same. "No," the judge said firmly. "Not everyone would have." Then he extended his hand. "I owe you more than words, Mr. Brooks." Ethan shook his hand out of respect. Lydia smiled warmly, relief flooding her eyes. But the most shocking part came afterward. Instead of anger or confrontation, instead of suspicion or harsh questions, the judge invited Ethan inside for tea. The townspeople, expecting a dramatic scene, waited nearby to witness conflict. But when they saw Ethan walk calmly into the judge's home with Harold and Lydia, they were stunned. People stood frozen. Whispering stopped. Nothing matched what they had expected. They expected shouting. They expected blame. They expected the judge to turn against the rancher. But instead, they saw gratitude and respect. Inside the house, the three sat together. Lydia explained everything from the beginning. Ethan filled in the gaps. The judge listened carefully, nodding, asking gentle questions. When the story finally ended, Harold turned to Ethan. "You acted with honor," he said. Ethan didn't know what to say. He simply nodded. When he stood up to leave, Lydia said, "Ethan, you're always welcome here." Those words touched him more than he showed. As Ethan rode down the hill, the setting sun cast a soft golden glow across the town. People watched him pass, confused and curious. Nothing made sense to them anymore. They had misjudged him. They had misjudged the situation, and they knew it. But Ethan didn't look at any of them. He kept his eyes on the road, calm and steady. He had done his part. He had spoken the truth, and the judge believed him. The town, however, was left with a shock they would talk about for weeks. Because instead of a scandal, they got the truth. Instead of anger, they saw gratitude. And instead of a quiet rancher walking away alone, they saw a man who had earned the deepest respect of a powerful family. What Ethan did for the judge's wife had changed everything quietly, honestly, and without expecting anything in return. The days following the judge's return became strangely peaceful for Ethan Brooks. The whispers in Redstone Creek slowed down once people realized the truth. Some felt embarrassed for doubting Ethan. Others simply changed the subject whenever his name came up. But no matter how the townspeople reacted, Ethan continued living the same quiet life on his ranch. Yet something small but important had changed inside him. He felt a new kind of calm, almost like a weight had lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in years, Ethan felt connected to people in a way he had avoided before. One bright morning, Lydia and the judge arrived on Ethan's ranch without warning. Their carriage stopped near his barn. Ethan, who had been repairing a broken fence post, looked up in surprise. He wiped his hands on his jeans and approached them. Lydia stepped down carefully with her husband's help. She was still recovering, but she looked much stronger now. Her cheeks had regained a bit of color, and her smile carried warmth and gratitude. "Ethan," she said softly, "we hope we're not disturbing your work." "You're never a disturbance," Ethan replied, a rare softness in his voice. The judge nodded firmly. "We came because there's something we want to discuss with you." Ethan raised an eyebrow, not sure what to expect. They walked toward the small wooden table near his porch. Lydia sat down gently, and the judge remained standing beside her. "We know how much you've done for our family," Lydia began. "Not just the day you carried me to the clinic, but all the days after that when you helped me around the house." Ethan looked down, almost embarrassed. He never liked being praised too much. "I only did what was needed," he said. "That's exactly why it means so much," Lydia replied. The judge stepped forward. "Ethan, we want you to know, our home is open to you anytime. You don't have to stand outside or leave quickly. You are part of this place now." The words hit Ethan more deeply than he let show. For many years, he had lived alone in silence. Hearing someone say he belonged somewhere was something he didn't expect. "I appreciate that," Ethan said quietly. The judge then glanced at Lydia and nodded. She took out an envelope and placed it gently on the table. "This is for you," she said softly. Ethan didn't reach for it right away. "What's this?" "A small thank you," the judge said. "Something to help with your ranch. You mentioned your barn roof needed repairs, and your water pump breaks often. Consider this our way of helping you the way you helped us." "I don't need money," Ethan said immediately, shaking his head. "I didn't do anything for a reward." Lydia smiled kindly. "We know. But please accept it anyway, not as payment, but as friendship." The judge added, "And if you still don't want the money, then use it to help someone else in town one day. But take it." Ethan hesitated. He wasn't a man who accepted gifts easily. But the warmth in their eyes told him this wasn't something to argue about. Slowly, he picked up the envelope and nodded once. "Thank you," he said quietly. They spent a few more minutes talking. mostly Lydia asking about his animals, and Ethan explaining the repairs he planned to do. It felt comfortable, almost like having old friends visit. When they finally left, Ethan watched their carriage disappear down the road, the sunlight reflecting off the wheels. He stood there for a long moment, feeling something unfamiliar, peace mixed with belonging. Then he tucked the envelope into his shirt pocket and returned to his work. The weeks passed, and the town slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Children played near the creek, farmers tended to their fields, and the bakery filled the air with sweet smells each morning. But something was different. Townspeople greeted Ethan more warmly now. A few would say, "Good morning, Ethan," and he would nod politely, surprised each time. Others would tip their hats, showing quiet respect. Even the store owner, who had barely spoken to Ethan before, now asked if he needed anything special. Ethan didn't talk much in return, but he appreciated the change. One afternoon, as Ethan rode into town for supplies, he noticed a small crowd gathered near the old well in the center of town. Curiosity wasn't something that often pulled him closer, but he rode slowly to see what was happening. A young boy had slipped near the well and injured his knee. His mother was trying to comfort him, but the child was crying too much to walk. "Can someone help me take him home?" the mother asked. "It's too far for me to carry him alone." People looked around, unsure. Most were busy or didn't want to get involved. Ethan stepped off his horse silently. He walked over to the mother and gently said, "He can ride with me." The mother looked relieved. "Are you sure?" "Thank you." Ethan lifted the child carefully, placed him on the saddle, and walked the horse slowly while the mother walked beside them. The boy stopped crying once he realized he was safe. When they reached the house, the mother thanked Ethan repeatedly. "You're a good man," she said with a grateful smile. Her words reminded him of something Lydia had said not long ago. He nodded and returned to town, not expecting or wanting anything in return. After this small act of kindness, the town began seeing Ethan differently. The whispers that once carried doubt now carried admiration. People no longer looked at him as the lonely rancher who kept to himself. They saw him as someone trustworthy, someone who cared, even quietly. A few days later, Lydia invited Ethan to join a small gathering at their home. It wasn't fancy. Just a simple dinner with a few friends. Ethan wasn't sure at first. He had never been part of such gatherings before. But when Lydia insisted gently, he agreed. At the dinner, everyone greeted him warmly. The judge introduced him proudly, saying, "This man has done more for this family and this town than most will ever know." Ethan felt shy under the attention, but Lydia made sure he felt comfortable. She talked to him about the new flowers she planted, asked about his horses, and even teased him lightly about how quiet he always was. Later that evening, as Ethan walked outside to breathe the cool night air, the judge joined him. "You know," the judge said, looking out toward the fields, "I used to wonder why you kept to yourself so much. Now I understand. You didn't need noise, you just needed purpose." Ethan looked down, unsure how to respond. "You have a good heart, Ethan," the judge continued. "This town is better because of you." They stood in silence after that, watching the stars appear one by one. It felt peaceful. Over the next few weeks, Ethan found himself visiting the judge's family, often sometimes to help, sometimes just to talk for a few minutes. Lydia always welcomed him with a smile. Harold respected him deeply, and the town slowly accepted him as someone important. One early evening, as Ethan rode back to his ranch, he looked out over the fields, glowing under the sunset. The world felt different now, not because the land had changed, but because he had allowed people into his life. He had never wanted attention. He had never asked for gratitude. But life had a way of bringing people together at the right moment. The day he carried Lydia to the clinic, Ethan had thought it was just a necessary act. He never imagined it would change his life, her life, and the town forever. Now, as he reached his ranch and stepped down from his horse, he felt lighter. He felt stronger. He felt connected. The quiet rancher who once lived alone was no longer just a shadow on the edge of town. He was someone people trusted. Someone people respected. Someone people called a friend. And the judge's wife, Lydia, often said that the kindness Ethan showed would stay in her heart forever. Redstone Creek never forgot what happened. Because sometimes, the most shocking thing isn't a loud event. Sometimes, it's the quiet bravery of a simple man doing the right thing. And what the Lone Rancher did for the judge's wife became a story the whole town carried for generations. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was pure, honest, and unforgettable.